Hi class, in this video we're going to go over Jinja, actually Jinja 2. This should have been in the deploying files chapter, but I thought it was a little too much at that time, so I kind of held off on it. Jinja is a template language for files. A lot of times we have to deploy files to a bunch of different servers, and when we do, the file is slightly different depending on the server that we're deploying it to. So what Jinja does is it's a part of Python. It's a module for Python, and basically it allows you to put some logic into a template file. And when you run your Ansible script, it renders that template file and then deploys it to the server. So what I did was I created some files. They're on D2L. Created some Ansible scripts and created a var file and then created two template files. So let's look at those files. So I'm inside of my Ansible working. I am signed in as DevOps user. All my machines, the times are synchronized. So I'm going to open up code in this directory. What I'm doing is I'm saying open that directory, which is my current directory. Okay, so I'm going to first look at script 1. I'm actually going to double click on it. So if you single click, it'll open it temporarily. So when you click on another file, it'll close that one and open another one. If you double click, it'll keep it pinned here. So here's my Ansible Playbook. I have one play in it. I'm using this vars file, so let's open up that vars file. And just think of this vars file as some sort of data file I had for my servers that had the short name, the long name, the IP address, the subnet mask, the gateway for and the DNS for all my servers. So there's RHS1, RHS2, and I use this var file for a bunch of different purposes. And again, it's in YAML format. Um, so let's go and look at, you don't actually need these dots, but I'm gonna leave them there because that's what I have on the website. But this is my var file. So what I'm going to do is point to that var file. Instead of listing all the vars here, I can have all my vars in one file and just keep referring to that file. So I'm going to use this for multiple purposes. So as I run this Ansible script, those vars will be loaded in for this play and will be accessible to my task. In this particular task, I only have one task. So what I'm going to do is create custom Etsy host files for all my servers. Now, while I'm doing this, I'm going to actually point to a temp file, not the actual host file. In case you mess it up, I don't want you to mess up your machines. So if this was a real production thing, I would make sure everything works and make sure it overwrites the current Etsy host file and not writes a temp one. So in the lab, I have you create a templates folder. Then what I'm going to do is I'm using the templates module. So the destination will be Etsy host. Temporarily, I'm just going to make it Etsy temp, Etsy host temp. And then I'm going to use this template file to render the file that I'm going to deploy. Because the file I'm going to deploy is going to be different on RHS1 versus RHS2. And I don't want to create multiple versions of the same file. So let's look at this template file, etsyhost.j2. The J2 is a Jinja 2 template. Again, this is written for Python. It's a module for Python that allows you to generate template files with some logic in it to have certain values replaced in that file. So I'm going to open up host.j2. It doesn't know what a J2 file is, you can search the marketplace to look. And at that point, it will know the syntax. I'm going to do that just to see if there's anything. Um, yeah, I can install this plugin for Jinja files. So I'm going to go back to my, okay, so now it knows it's I didn't mean to do that, a Jinja file. So I'm going to go back to my host.j2, and basically, for whether I'm talking about RHS1 or RHS2, I need these top two lines. You know, I'm just resolving localhost, localhost dot local domain, localhost 4, localhost 4 dot local domain 4 to my IPv4 loopback. And for this line, I'm going to resolve all these names to my IPv6 loopback. Now, maybe I do this because I'm old school, but I generally like to, every time I set up a system, I like to resolve the real name of that server and the short name for that server, the long name and the short name to the loopback as well. Because you can't always resolve it to the IP address, because if you do, maybe the network card is down, and at that point, the server wouldn't know how to get to that IP. So I always like to use the loopback because the loopback interface is um, always up. So what I'm using is two Ansible facts. I'm going to use the domain name, which is the fully qualified domain name, and another Ansible fax um, host name, which is the short name. So basically, when you run your Ansible playbook, it does that fax gathering task, and it's going to assign a value to these two variables. And so when I render this host.j2 file using Jinja 2, it's going to replace these two variables with the actual values. For if I run this on RHS1, this will be rhs1.contoso.com, and this will be RHS1. If I render this for RHS2, this will be rhs2.contoso.com and RHS2, the long name and the short name. And so what I want to do is, in my vars file, I'm going to be looping through this file. And basically, it's going to load all those variables up. And right here is my loop for host and network data. So in my vars file, I have a dictionary item called network data. And this is one list item because it's represented by the dash. This is another list item, and then another list item. And so I have essentially 4 list items in this dictionary item. So it's going to loop, and the first time through the loop, it's going to network data is going to assign, it's going to re-network data, and it's going to assign host this first list item. In that, we'll have 6 dictionary items. So it's going to then look for a dictionary item for host.ipv4. That will be this value right here. Then it's going to it's going to put a tab host.long name. That will be here. And host.short name. That will be here. So there's some other information here that I don't need, but maybe I use this var file for additional purposes. So I'm just only using the first three dictionary items in this list. So it's going to replace, it's going to put the IPv4 address here, tab, the long name, and the short name. So it's going to resolve the long name and the short name to the IPv4 address. But I don't want to do it. I don't want to add an entry for the server that I'm on. So if I'm on RHS1, I don't want to add an entry for 10.0.0.4 because I'm using the loopback. If I'm on RHS2, I don't want to add an entry for 10.0.0.5 because I'm already resolving this to the loopback address. So I put this logic in here as long as host.longname doesn't equal my inventory host. So as I loop through this list, if the long name is the machine that I'm working on, don't add an entry for that. Move on to the next item in the list. Just because I don't want to have duplicate entries for the same host. I don't want to resolve one host to a loopback address, then also for the IP address, because at that point it won't actually work. So I'm putting some logic in here to loop through this dictionary item for all the items in that dictionary item. Don't do it for the host that I'm on, and then add a line to this file. So it's going to replace this with 3 lines. One, if I'm on RHS1, it'll add a line for RHS2, DC, then the MS server. If I'm on RHS2, it's going to add a line for RHS1, DC, and the MS server. So let's execute that playbook. Guys, I've already checked it. So I'm going to do Ansible Playbook, and I'm going to do Lab 7 Script 1. So I'm doing the facts gathering for both machines, and it did it. Guys, there was no change for me because I already ran this script. So I'm running this against RHS2 and RHS1. So let's look at the file generated on RHS1. I'm going to open up a terminal so you can see. So I'm going to cat etc host.temp. And again, I just made the temp, so if you screw this up, it's not going to mess up your system. So I have my first 2 lines. And again, those are from my template file before it rendered it. When I mean by render, I mean replace all these variables and code with the actual data. I'm going to try to do this way so you can see both. So it added the first 2 lines. Now it added this line right here because this right here is going to be replaced with, for this machine, rhs1.contoso.com and rhs1, short name and a long name. Then it's going to get to this loop. When I run this on RHS1, it's going to skip over this first list item because this first list item happens to be RHS1 and I'm on RHS1. So if that's as long as it's not that, it'll enter the loop. So it entered the loop and added entry for RHS2 and the IP address for it, DC and the IP address for it. Again, the long and the short name. the IP address, long name, short name, IP address, long name, short name, IP address, long name, short name. And it went through all the items in that var file, and then it added entries for these fake hosts. So let's look at what it did on RHS2. Let's look at the file there. So I'm going to SSH to RHS2, and I'm going to run a command um, cat etc host.temp. So I'm going to look at the file on RHS2. So again, I have those two lines. I have an entry for the machine that I'm on, which is RHS2. I'm resolving that to the loopback. So I don't want to resolve that to the IP address as well. But when it did the loop this time, it skipped over RHS2 but included RHS1, which is slightly different than up here. So this can be really good if you're writing config files for a bunch of different services on a bunch of different servers. So you can have one template file and then render that template file on your control host before you push it out to all your servers. So that's kind of the point of the Jinja 2 template files. Keep in mind that the files are rendered on the control host before they're sent out. So all this is code that's going to be replaced with actual data from wherever its source is. This data right here is coming from, it's an Ansible fact. This data right here is a magic variable that's automatically set for us. Um, this is from our var file. Again, this is from the var file, and this is each list item in the var as it loops through. So I'm going to do it a slightly different way now. I'm going to look at script 2 versus script 1. So I have a command called diff. It will compare two files. So I'm going to do lab 7 script 1 versus lab 7 script 2. So the only thing that's different between script 1 and script 2 is instead of referring to host.j2 template, I'm referring to host1.j2 template. So other than that, both files are identical. So I'm only going to open up the template file. So again, it is going to loop through that vars file, but instead of doing the logic as I do the loop, like right here, I only go through the loop as long as the host, the list item doesn't match the machine that I'm on. Here I'm doing it a little bit differently. I'm throwing in an if statement. As long as instead of doing it in the loop, I'm showing you how to do an if statement. Guys, one thing I wanted to point out. When I refer to a variable here, I have to enclose it in double brackets. But when I do it down here, you can see that a statement, a J2 statement always begins with a bracket, %, and ends with a bracket, %. So in these statements, I don't enclose variables with the brackets. That's only done when you just want to do a raw replacement. Replace that variable with the actual data. Here it's a statement, I'm doing a for loop, but here I'm not in the middle of a statement, so I'm just putting just the variable names is going to be replaced. So anytime you're in the middle of a statement, this is how you refer to a variable. If you're not in a statement, you want to refer to a variable like this. So here I'm not doing the testing in my loop, I'm going to do it inside. So if the long name doesn't match, is not the machine that I'm on, then add the entries. And here's the end of my if statement. And here's the end of my for loop. So it's essentially the same thing, but I'm just doing it a slightly different way. Um, there might be a better reason to do this. If you want to do more logic, you might be able to do this. But by doing it this method, if you're on the inventory host, it's going to skip that machine altogether. It won't even go in the loop. It'll move it to the next list item. Here, it'll at least go in the loop, and then you might want to do stuff outside the if statement to that host. But in this particular case, I'm not doing that, but just to be aware of how it's done. The book mentions both methods, so I want to give you an example of both methods. Okay, this is kind of a big topic. We're only just touching on it. So just keep in mind that this is really a template file with some logic built in. So when you render the file, it's going to replace all that logic with actual data before pushing that file out. So you can have one file that you can customize for a bunch of different host machines. I'm just doing this to Etsy host, but you can do this if you wanted to set up DHCP servers for different subnets or DNS servers with different zone files that you want to host. There's all kind of uses for this. Okay, guys, that's it for this lab. The next one we're going to talk about, which will be the last video, is going to be um, looking at roles. So thank you, and I'll see you in the next video.